I'm Erik Townsend for ZeroHedge Debates. Most of you also know me as the host of the Macro Voices podcast. Tonight, we're bringing you the first in a series of debates about the formative nuclear renaissance. What will it mean for the global economy, markets, and society? And how many of the world's energy challenges can we eventually expect to solve with nuclear energy? The way tonight's debate came about was that I first approached ZeroHedge to propose a debate on the topic of wind, solar, and batteries versus advanced nuclear fission, addressing which is better suited to solving baseload energy transition away from fossil fuel dependence. But after weeks of trying, neither ZeroHedge nor I can find a worthy debate opponent. Seems like there's lots of wind, solar, and batteries gurus experts out there who don't know shit about nuclear energy and don't really have the ability to keep up with that. If anybody can help us find that debate opponent, we want to do that debate. We still want to do that debate. But for tonight, we're going to focus on the scope and extent of the coming nuclear renaissance. There's a major initiative to triple nuclear energy capacity around the world by 2050. But as a point of reference, it would take about 25 times current nuclear generation capacity if you wanted to completely replace all of the energy that we derive from fossil fuels. So is tripling nuclear the right goal? Is that enough? Some people say it's already too much. It might be too ambitious. So what's the straight scoop on these small modular reactors? And what about all of that fusion stuff? Is fusion better than fission? What's that? We're going to answer all of those questions. And in order to do that, I'm joined by two esteemed guests. Mark Nelson is the former, edit please, Mark Nelson, I can't. Oh boy, you caught me. I'm on a live event asking my editors to fix my screw up. Sorry, folks. Mark Nelson is the founder of Radiant Energy Group, a consultancy that advises everyone from nuclear energy developers, such as the nuclear company, to power utilities contemplating construction of nuclear plants. But don't be fooled, folks. Consulting is just Mark's day job. His passion for his entire adult life has been advocating in favor of nuclear energy. And I, for one, don't think it is any exaggeration to say that Mark deserves credit for doing as much as anyone else to bring about the formative nuclear renaissance. So, Mark, thank you for your service. Thanks for bringing nuclear back into the spotlight as it should be. And thanks for joining us this evening.
Thanks for having me, Erik.
And are in the opposite corner for tonight's debate, and I'm not sure it's really a debate, it's probably going to be more of a discourse, is a green chicken avatar. Well, as energy investors around the world already know, Doomberg's Substack blog is one of the most respected sources of boutique investment research for energy oriented investors anywhere. But Doomberg, I'm going to leave it to you to explain why the pseudonym and the green chicken avatar.
Yeah, Erik, first of all, thanks for the invite. Mark, great to see you again, my friend. The Green Chicken Avatar started as a growth hack on Twitter. You can't be remembered if you don't stand out. And when we launched Doomberg now 4 years ago, which seems like forever, we decided to go with something that was a bit more colorful. And then, as the brand grew, one of the things we observed over time is that when people de-anonymize, the brand intrigue collapses. And so now, it's mostly just for brand. We stay behind the green avatar. And last point is I'm just one person of a team. I might be the voice of Doomberg and appear, in public like this, but picking which of our faces would represent the brand was also a bit of a challenge. But yeah, it's a lot of fun. We do, as you say, we write on Substack and my first ZeroHedge debate. So really much, very much looking forward to it.
There's no specific debate topic tonight other than what's the best way for society to get the most out of nuclear energy. We're confident that there will be no shortage of impassioned and contrasting viewpoints, and I'll be joining the conversation myself as well, which should add to the conflict. We have a more conventional debate format planned for our next event, which will air on August 14th, when my guests will be Oklo founder Jake DeWitt and former TerraPower advanced reactor designer Dr. Nick Turan. Before we get started, I'd like to thank Van Eck for sponsoring both of these events and read you their sponsor message. As artificial intelligence reshapes industries, the demand for reliable clean energy is skyrocketing, especially from hyperscalers and data centers. Nuclear energy is poised to meet that challenge. Van Eck's NLR ETF gives investors access to the full nuclear ecosystem, utilities, uranium miners, and service providers, offering a diversified approach to this accelerated energy transition. With strong policy support from the United States, France, Japan, and China, nuclear energy is back in the spotlight, clean, continuous, and essential. The NLR ETF is engineered for the future, helping to power the digital age while providing a risk-managed way to invest in a sector critical to global energy independence. Explore VanEck's NLR ETF, where innovation meets energy. Visit vaneck.com/NLRZH or simply look up the ticker NLR. That's November Lima Romeo on the New York Stock Exchange. With that sponsor message out of the way, let's get right into tonight's debate. I want to start with the question of what the goal for this formative nuclear renaissance should be in the first place. How much nuclear generation capacity does the world need in order to power all those AI data centers and all the other things that are coming up on the horizon? And how much can we afford to build? And most importantly, what could we do to make it cheaper? To me, right now, nuclear energy is the safest, cleanest, most environmentally responsible energy source in existence for rich countries that can afford energy that costs considerably more than energy produced from coal and gas. For those lucky few, nuclear energy is an absolutely fantastic invention. But if we use the recent Vodal project as a proxy for the cost of building new nuclear capacity, it's just not economically viable to talk about nuclear energy as our primary energy source. But if we could somehow figure out a way to make nuclear energy cost less than energy from coal and gas, then we could literally usher in a change in the course of human history on the scale of the Industrial Revolution, if not larger. I'm going to say that again because it's so important. I'm personally convinced that if we could figure out how to make nuclear cost less than coal and gas, then we could usher in a change in the course of history bigger than the Industrial Revolution. Not everybody agrees with that. I'll substantiate that opinion later on in this event. Right now, I want to move to Mark Nelson. Mark, imagine that you are in charge of the world calling the shots. What should the path forward be? How much of the world's energy source should be replaced with nuclear? How should we go about it? How should we build it? What technologies should we use? What's the approach? You're in charge.
Well, first of all, I'm ideologically opposed to saying if I were in charge and just forcing everybody, but I will play along for the purposes of this discussion. So the world is almost entirely using nuclear energy at the moment for electricity. Electricity is just a part of the energy we use. As long as China seems committed from a national strategic perspective to make batteries cheaper and cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, I think we'll see that have knock-on effects, increasing the number of ways that electricity is used as stored in batteries to do things that humans want from energy. There may be some disagreements on this show. Maybe we'll have a fight about it. But if battery costs keep crashing, it means that electricity will keep creeping into other directions because the cost of storing it when you need it, which is one of the incredible advantages of fossil fuels over electricity itself at the moment, will be reduced. So if electricity keeps expanding its uses, if AI keeps driving electricity demand growth in industrialized countries, then nuclear, which is already good at making electricity, will see some growth there too. Should nuclear be used for heat, then we see nuclear going to be creeping into a lot of other areas where currently the best thing to do with nuclear is just to make steam, turn a turbine, and make electricity. So at the moment, the world's using about 10% nuclear for its electricity sources. Electricity is growing extremely fast in China, and China is building most of the world's new nuclear plants at the moment. The key thing here is China is building nuclear plants at a very slow and conservative pace, even though Chinese nuclear is cheaper than natural gas electricity in China, and it's competitive with, depending on how you look at it or which time span, it's cheaper than Chinese coal. So in countries that have much cheaper gas, it's a little bit harder, and you'd have to be in charge of the world and a nuclear fanatic like me to try to force people to use more nuclear, or you would have to have a climate or environmental imperative or even energy security imperative to demand out of market use of nuclear electricity. In that case, you would see a bigger expansion. Since you seem to be wanting a target from me, well, as a huge fan of nuclear energy and as somebody who knows that There's nothing cheaper in the energy world than an already operating and paid off nuclear plant, which you only get if you pay the money up front to build it and then run it for 30 years. I think eventually by the end of the century, so by 2100, I think the world will be best off if it's using as much as 30 or even 40% nuclear from primary energy. That may be incredibly ambitious, but considering the fact that if a nuclear plant gets built today, it's probably never going to turn off. It's about accumulating that heavy capital investment in nuclear over time and seeing the countries that do so see an increasing economic advantage for doing so. So at the moment, fossil fuels are still quite cheap in many countries. If you're not doing it for climate reasons or for environmental reasons or energy security reasons, there's a number of countries that may not make the jump into nuclear until it's offered as a complete package for cheap by a country they trust. So a number of countries are getting this nuclear expansion from Russia for the moment because they can trust Russia to get the plant built and done pretty much on time and at Russia's own financial risk. If more countries can join that, either Chinese entrepreneurship actually come to the fore in nuclear, if they're able to sell nuclear plants, which hasn't really happened yet, and if America and Europe somehow come back to the table, we could see an advance towards that 30 or 40% by the end of the century.
Thanks, Mark. Let's hear now from Doomberg. Same question. How much nuclear energy do we need in a perfect world, and what should our strategy be to build it out?
Thanks, Eric. Yeah, anticipating this question, I did some research. I pulled up the trustee statistical review of world energy and looked at where we get our electricity today. One really important thing that I think matters a lot as it pertains to answering this question is there's a lot of sort of discussion about the difference between baseload power, which obviously coal and natural gas and nuclear energy can produce, which is steady 24/7 power, and intermittent power, which is the bane of grid operators who are forced to deal with massive amounts of wind and solar energy pouring onto their grids. But there's actually a third parameter that is really important from the operation of a grid's perspective, at least, and that is the dispatchability of the electricity. And you can be base load power, but not very good at dispatchable. And dispatchable, of course, means a grid operator can toggle supply from you on very short time frames to very closely match supply with demand, which is the key of operating all modern electricity grids. And so natural gas, for example, is really good at dispatchability. It can be spun up and spun down on very short time frames, which is why natural gas peaker plants are pretty popular. Impoundment hydroelectricity is very good for grid matching and dispatchability, whereas coal it's theoretically dispatchable, but it's not ideal. You wouldn't want to build a coal plant to be a fully dispatchable, and the same goes for nuclear energy. As France is finding out, you really want nuclear energy to target baseload power that doesn't need to be dispatchable. And so when I look at the current fuel market share 2024 from the statistical review of world energy, my view is that all electricity that isn't dispatchable is the first target for nuclear. And so you can replace all of the coal being burned, all of the oil being burned, and 2.2% of the world's electricity still comes from oil, if you can believe that. All of the renewables being burned, and all of the other, which, who knows what's in that bucket. But if nuclear was 9% of the electricity grid mix in 2024, that subset of non-dispatchable power adds up to 54%. And so a grid that has just natural gas, just hydroelectric, and just nuclear is fully baseload, but also with a fair amount of dispatchability embedded in it, which allows grid operators to match between overnight lows and after work highs and so on. And so at 54%, up from 9 today, I think a target for nuclear energy, as it pertains to electricity, at least, is sixfold from here versus the existing grid. And then I do believe that for new builds, AI, which is something that Mark has been talking about for many, many months, nuclear is by far the superior source of electricity for incremental or additional capacity that is expected to be 24/7 operational, reliable, all of the metrics that matter to the successful operation of a data center. So the goal of 3 times from where we are today, which was set out at COP29, which is a ambition that we think is both achievable and realistic. That's probably, taking the 50% haircut of what we could do from where we are today. But I think 6x is pretty reasonable. Last thing I would say is nuclear is not really ideal for high-grade steam. There are some, Gen 4 reactor designs that could get you to the lower end of what, say, a natural gas cogeneration facility would get you. There are other reasons to do nuclear for thermal, but broadly speaking, I think a realistic objective is 5 to 6 times what we do today, focused primarily on baseload, but running up against the edge of when you need dispatchability.
Okay, thanks, Doomberg. I'd like to add my perspective on this topic as well. I think I agree with a lot of what both of you guys said. I see a need for the world to do 2 things in parallel. One is already underway. That's the Triple Nuclear Initiative. We need to leverage what we already know and what already works, which doesn't have to be tested or vetted or proven. We need to keep making more of it. But the nuclear that we have and that we know today costs too much in terms of capex to build it. It's cheap to operate it once it's built, but the cost of construction is still too high to make it competitive with other energy sources. So we ought to build as much of it as we can raise money for. But I think in parallel with that, and the reason I say we should do those things is we can't wait for new technology. We need to take what we already know and deploy it. In parallel with that, I very strongly believe that we need to evaluate Generation 4 better nuclear technologies, specifically with an eye toward what is the workhorse reactor design that we could identify and figure out how to mass produce the way we mass produce automobiles. And I don't mean like Westinghouse says they're supposedly mass producing SMRs, so it only takes 4.5 years to build one. I'm talking about once an hour, another nuclear reactor comes off a robotic assembly line. That sounds crazy to anyone who knows how the industry works today. But if you were to look at replacing all of the baseload energy that we depend on fossil fuels for, you'd have to run that assembly line for 14 years, producing one 100 megawatt thermal reactor per hour, 24/7, 365 for 14 years to make enough reactors in order to replace fossil fuels. And I contend if you were building that many, it's a completely different equation in terms of what it's going to cost. So I think the way to get the cost down is to take a different approach with newer technology, and that you have to expect is going to take longer. We can't afford to wait for it. So I want to move on to the next topic on our outline, which is cost reduction. As I just said, I contend there's a night and day difference between nuclear energy as we know it today versus nuclear energy, which fulfills the original promise from the 1970s, which was energy that's too cheap to meter. I don't think that was a false promise in the 1970s. I still think it's possible. I think we kind of screwed it up in the 1970s, but I still think we can get it right. And I contend that if we can get that right, we can completely change the course of world history. I call this the nuclear Henry Ford moment. In Ford's day, automobiles were a niche market, just like private jets. Everybody knew what they were, but only the filthy rich could afford to have one. So therefore, they were produced in very low volumes, and an assembly line would never have even made sense. But Ford famously had the foresight to recognize that his assembly line, if he could somehow use that to get the price down to the point where the average man could afford to buy an automobile, that would change everything. And the resulting explosion of demand would create a backlog of orders that even his automated assembly line could never keep up with. Now, the public will to phase out fossil fuels in favor of something else is overwhelming. So if we could somehow figure out how to make nuclear cost less than coal and build it faster, I say that we could create that same explosion of demand that made Ford's assembly line such a success. And I say that it could change the course of history because it would make energy cheaper than it's been since I was a kid. And to be sure, if we were mass producing those reactors on assembly lines, we could get the cost down a whole lot. But there's a lot of different ways to skin a cat. Mark Nelson, you are already advising the nuclear company on a completely different approach, fleet mode construction of conventional reactors. That's here and now. It's not waiting for any future technology. So why don't we start with that? If we're talking about the technology we already have, but we got to make it cheaper. That's so important. What do we do to keep rolling it out, roll it out faster, but do it cheaper than it's been done in the past?
Yeah, well, the nuclear company was started about 2 years ago for a very specific purpose, filling a gap in the nuclear ecosystem that used to be played imperfectly and with a lot of downsides by utilities themselves. Let me explain. So, electricity is a local thing, and you build out a system in a specific city, and as you make the grid bigger, you connect it to other cities and you grow. Utilities started in order to make these lines and wires and to connect up the biggest possible power plants that they could ensure maximum amount of customers using. So you shared a grid, you shared the power plants, and you provided cheaper and cheaper and cheaper electricity on a per unit basis to more and more customers, more and more power. And that was a 100-year process. Well, nuclear got invented as these utilities were in their heyday. The utilities saw it as just another energy source and they started ordering power plants. Each utility only needed a certain number of nuclear plants. And as the curve on the exponential growth of energy in the West started tapering off for many reasons, we could be lost an entire podcast talking about why we stopped growing energy supplies as much. We started having struggles in each of these utilities completing the nuclear plants. A lot of blame to go around, but basically each utility was used to ordering power plants and then executing the project, overseeing their own contractors and getting it done themselves. What that meant is a vendor like Westinghouse didn't build nuclear plants. They just provided the internals and made recommendations about how the plant ought to be designed around it. Then you would get a power plant architect engineer to design your plant and a construction team to build it, all under the watchful eye or careless eye of some of the utilities that went bankrupt trying to finish their nuclear plants, and it didn't work out. So the utilities that survived were the ones who had very strong hands building the 4, 5, or 6 nuclear plants maximum that they got completed. But then we stopped ordering them, we stopped building them, and each utility didn't need that much more power. So we say, oh, we want standardized nuclear, but who's supposed to order 10 utilities worth of standardized power plants? Each utility doesn't need it. And if you've ever tried to get multiple utilities to agree on a shared thing, it's just not happening. Some of the advanced nuclear designs are having real struggles because they thought they'd put together a consortium of a bunch of different utilities that are like their own kingdoms to get them to agree on shared standards. It just doesn't work. The nuclear company had a different idea. Design once, build many. And that's not just like the internals, like the Westinghouse part. It's the entire power plant that needs to be executed as a set project over and over again. Now, if you have a power plant design where you've got to change up the seismic structures, the part that have to resist earthquakes and major forces and airplane crashes and things like that, if that has to change each time you move to a different geology, a different surface, that won't work. But we're interested in designs of nuclear plants, proven technology that have the minimum amount of rework so we can plop them down over and over and get good at executing that power plant design for multiple customers or on multiple locations. So design once, build many. A difficult thing to do with each individual utility only needs a little bit more nuclear power, only sees themselves needing that much if they can't build it fast enough to bring in a lot of new customers. So the thought is we're not there to test out to see if this or that design for a nuclear plant works. We're interested in designs that are proven, that we can specialize in executing over and over. The big thing in the West is that mega projects have been done poorly. Any one leadership structure may only get to 1 or 2 mega projects in their life, depending on what you're talking about. There's not that many new airports needed. There's not that many new underground below city subways being put in, and each one of those have very special political problems putting it into place. We realize that nuclear has an advantage. Unlike a big long transmission line that goes through a lot of different political jurisdictions, a nuclear plant is relatively small and compact and can go in an individual spot. Through extremely careful, experienced management from mega projects, ones that have succeeded, ones where it's been saved by people, we're gathering up a super team of people who can execute big projects together. and making sure that under a common leadership structure, we design once and build many. That's the fleet scale approach. And we don't see any reason we can't start to approach the labor productivity and therefore the cost inflated a little bit for higher wages and some material cost differences that the Chinese are seeing building fleets of our reactor designs.
Thanks, Mark. Doomberg, how do we make it cheaper?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and I challenge perhaps a little bit of the sort of the fundamental axiom at the core of that question. Look, France and Ontario built nuclear reactors at a scale that we would all admire today 50, 60 years ago. And they did so cost competitively. The majority of Ontario and France's electricity still comes from nuclear today. This is a solved problem. Nuclear is expensive in the West because of political choices, either directly or indirectly. And I would also argue that China is cranking out nuclear reactors for roughly 3 billion a gigawatt in about 5 years from decision to go. But so is South Korea. And South Korea is the exception that proves the rule, which is to say, South Korea can build nuclear reactors as cheaply and as fast as China, and they are a Western developed nation. And so I think it is pretty instructive to look at the policy choices and the regulatory framework that exists in South Korea. And because they run an economy that is much more like, say, the US and Western Europe does than China does. But they prove that it is inherently possible. I agree wholeheartedly with everything that Mark just articulated. One of my big frustrations in observing and chronicling, writing about the nuclear industry is this fascination with cutting edge technology. This is a solved problem. Like, there's nothing wrong with Ontario's fleet of CANDU reactors or France's nuclear fleet other than mismanagement of that, occasionally trying to make room for intermittent renewables and trying to take baseload, non-dispatchable nuclear and force it to pretend like it's dispatchable. But by and large, like, Eisenhower was right. We're 60 years late. We could have been doing this decades ago. And then last thing I would say is a point that Mark makes, which so few people understand, but I think is absolutely critically important, is that once you build a nuclear reactor, properly maintained, it is effectively immortal. And so we would argue that Mark's fleet approach, we're going to take the AP1000 design, or we're going to take the CANDU reactor design, or we're going to take Korea's 1400 design, and the Western nuclear industry is going to collaborate, share best practices, and compete with Rosatom, for example, which I think is light years ahead of most of what's going on in the West. We're going to decide that this is the ultimate public good, in the same way that Eisenhower built, the freeway system. You couldn't build the freeway system today, the U.S. interstate highway system. The marginal cost to drive on that highway system is effectively free. There's some maintenance, a couple of cents per gallon in the gas tax. But once built, it never shuts off. And so, there comes a point where market forces fail, and government needs to get involved, and government needs to subsidize. And so I think, much of what we see in the nuclear space, the very much, appropriate amount of excitement and rejuvenation that's going on in the sort of the as Mark would call it, the nuclear bro space, is justified, but we don't need to invent solutions when clearly other countries are already doing it at a scale, for a cost, and at a pace that we would admire and wish we could replicate here. That proves to me this is not a technology question. It's not make the reactors slightly better or cheaper to build. No, the cost to build nuclear in the US, in Western Europe, is a political choice. And so we need to fix our politics collectively. And the support for nuclear, my final point, on the ascent as it is, and Mark does great work on polling, the public's stance vis-a-vis nuclear. We're not quite at all-time high for supports, but we're certainly off the recent lows. Now is the time with, for example, Chris Wright as Secretary of Energy in the Trump administration, to really make a bold push for the regulatory and political changes that are needed in order to make this the greatest of all public goods built for the next generation of global citizens.
Let's talk a little bit more about this question about construction of major public works projects in the West and our ability to do it. Because let's face it, there are two significant nuclear completions that have happened in the last half century. That's Vodal and Baraka. Somehow, don't know how, despite the fact that all this stuff was invented by Americans, rah, 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 USA, we're number one, except guess what? We built Vodal for $16,000 per kilowatt of capex, whereas KHNP, which is the Korean builder that competes with Westinghouse, spent about $3,500 per kilowatt to build Baraka, approximately the same reactor design, so small differences between an AP1000 and an APR 1400, but pretty darn close. Yet it's almost a 4-to-1 on cost. And I agree with Doomberg. That's not a technology issue. It has nothing to do with the difference in the two reactors. It's we don't really have our act together for doing large bespoke construction projects on time and on budget in the West anymore. What's wrong? How do we fix it? Mark?
Well, I'll tell you something that the UAE did. They were very humble and very careful in approaching this problem. They hired outstanding advisors who had successfully delivered nuclear programs, even in the anti-nuclear era in America. And they brought them over and were like, we're your students. Tell us what we need to do. Show us how we ought to manage this contractor. Because it's in nuclear, it's just not the case in the West at the moment that there's an equivalent to Rosatom where they just do it all. Even the Koreans were taking a very big first step exporting nuclear outside of their country. And ENEC, Emirates Nuclear Energy Corporation, was not a passive consumer of Korean services. They were there on the ground, watching like hawks, intervening where necessary. They were driving the project along, in part because that's the way that the Americans that came over, who had cut their teeth doing that in the 1970s and 80s, were helping show them how to do. So there was very strong, dedicated core of team leaders, outstanding selection of experienced advisors, and then being very active, intelligent consumers of a Team Korean approach to nuclear. So seeing the project in 3 dimensions is one of the most important things. Where some nuclear projects have failed and become too expensive is treating this like something you can order and then it'll just take care of itself. No, that's not the case. If you're the one ordering a nuclear plant, you have to be as serious and as involved as if you were building it. So in some ways, what the nuclear company is wanting to do is, without being all the construction crew, getting as deep as possible into making sure that stuff is done absolutely right, in an orderly fashion, deep investigation of supply chains, maybe trust, but mostly verify if we're going to be consuming reactor tech from other parties. So that's part of it. And the alignment of incentives is so important. In the end, what you had in some of the recent catastrophic over budget approaches in the West has been that different parties involved in the nuclear project were extremely important, were required, but were not incentivized the same way to get it done because they didn't have a stake in the final performance of the project. They were on the critical path, but were not going to benefit as much from getting done extremely quickly, except that it killed off the nuclear renaissance of the Bush years and the Obama years. So at the point that a project starts going poorly and contractors feel they're not going to be able to be involved on the next one, or they're seeing future projects canceled, everybody starts turning on each other, and it takes incredibly strong leadership to keep it together. Part of the approach here is that if really good management of an early project leads to follow-on orders or confidence in the team, then you're going to be able to make sure that people know that good performance on the project will lead to a full career and excellent opportunities doing it again and again. That's part of the fleet approach. I will mention about France is that, contrary to popular legend among the nuclear bros, each nuclear plant in France was individually designed, had different architects, had different architecture, had different approaches to the turbine buildings, had different geology that had to be accounted for. But what it had was an extremely firm, educated, and powerful customer that watched everything like an absolute hawk and had incredible discipline across the engineering sector and construction sector in France. And of course, a lot of political backing to get the job done. So profoundly talented and motivated public servants who were in charge of this, the EDF, the state utility, made sure that the work was done right and done well. And that was more important than exact standardization of design. It should be good to hear that, because it means that the magic formula is incredibly good people, properly incentivized, properly motivated, working with an iron hand to keep all the different parties involved in the construction project aligned and on schedule. You basically need some of the most important people in the company on the site, in the trailers, night and day, in the dirt with the workers. That's what you need. And if you have that, I think that nuclear isn't magic. We're going to be able to build it.
Doomberg, what do we need to do to get our shit together so that Americans can build an invention that was invented by Americans for some kind of price that competes with what South Koreans can build that American invention for?
Yeah, first of all, I agree wholeheartedly with everything that Mark just said, which makes for, I guess, a poor debate, but perhaps a good discussion. Actually, I think Americans need not build it. And one of the things that I think is sort of the elephant in the room that I'd like to bring forward is, U.S. foreign policy adventures and various conflicts with perceived enemies is standing in the way of the nuclear renaissance. In a world where the U.S. could put out to bid building parts or all of a fleet of envisioned reactors, either to replace coal on the grid or to power AI data centers, and you would take requests for proposals from Russia, China, and South Korea, Canada, and Westinghouse, and take the best of what's available in the world. You need not build it yourself for it to happen. As Mark correctly points out, the United Arab Emirates bought Korean technology and just implemented it very well, had a national project management type campaign, multi-generational, training the next nuclear scientists and workers and technicians, a holistic approach, really one of the most pragmatic and, I would argue, brilliant examples of modern project management. And they will bequeath the next generations of their citizens with immortal, for now and counting, immortal nuclear reactors that will provide steady 95% capacity factor, carbon-free, clean, marginally cheap electricity for generations. And so, I was just going through the stats. Like, Rosatom is a technical powerhouse, but because of the war, we don't need to get into the politics of it. But they have something like 35 or 40 reactors, either under construction or contracted, all around the world. They have a reputation for outstanding delivery against their objectives. Turkey, Egypt, Bangladesh, Iran, even in China, they're part of China's mix. India, Slovakia, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan. There's no, you don't have to be an extremely wealthy country for nuclear to make sense for you. You just need to execute your nuclear projects in a way that is far better than what the U.S. has done.
Though, Mr. Doomberg, can I add a little bit of
100%.
complexity and sprinkles here? So I studied Russian when I was an engineering student, spent time over there, had an internship in a former Soviet country in a garment factory, was very interested in Russia. And then there's the complete and total breakdown between East and West that happened with the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. So in some ways, it's kind of sad, because I think there's a lot that could be learned from Russia's successes in nuclear, but I want to add a little bit of complexity. Russia must be thanking its lucky stars that Western companies are not really in a position to go and hire all of those brilliant Rosatom construction managers who came out of college in the 90s and have been doing nothing but delivering very complicated, very difficult nuclear plants in novel countries, harsh climates around the world for customers with no recourse to saying, oh, we can't do it. I mean, look, if Putin shakes his hands with a country's leader and says, we're getting you a nuclear plant, we're going to finance it, just because you aren't getting what you think you need from the locals or the local workers or the government, you don't get to quit. You don't get to go home. You just have to solve it. And it's on your back to deliver what Rosatom promised the other countries. So there's really intense situations where I don't think Rosatom is going to end up making much money on a lot of these projects. It's going to be a little bit like loss leaders. They're going to have all the incentives in place to do an incredible job, and they can't exactly go and complain to Putin, say, oh, this isn't fair. They said they'd provide more laborers or they'd give us better housing, and they haven't done it. They just have to get it done. And we can't really poach their workers unless the West got over the squeamishness of hiring away Russian managers. And those managers
Sure.
would then need to get their families out of Russia. So we're in this weird time where there's an amazing amount of inspiration to the West coming from the fact that the Russians are beating our pants off and getting these giant projects underway in strategic countries that should be able to partner with the West, but we're not able to partner with Russia right now. I think what we have to do is get very humble and figure out what they're doing that seems to be working so well. How on earth, in the face of these sanctions, breakdown and access to Western supply chains, how are the Russians getting these things done with limited resources, nearly on time, on budget enough? I mean, to not get in trouble with their own directors of Rosatom. How are they doing it? We have a lot to learn, and I think that's one of the things that I'm going to try to figure out. How are they building these plants on time, on budget, across the world in new locations?
So 2 things to add to that. First of all, I think we're making the same point. But my point is, if you're putting it out to bid and Rosatom wants to lose money building reactors for the West, let them do it. But also, they're kind of operating a printer and ink model, right? Like they're selling you not just the plant, but the future fuel and the maintenance and all of the service contracts that come with it. And finally, Russia is gaining significant geopolitical advantage by behaving in this way. And again, it's kind of taboo in the West to talk about Russia in any kind of a positive light whatsoever. They're a gas station masquerading as a country. If you listen to Lindsey Graham, I think that's just total nonsense. They are a very sophisticated, technologically advanced country that is providing the world with world-beating nuclear technology at reasonably affordable prices on time. And who cares what their motivations are? They should be amongst the people competing for the bids. If Western companies can't build nuclear reactors, let's let the Chinese and the Koreans and the Russians fight it out. We do this in virtually every other supply chain. Why would nuclear be any different?
Well, I'll tell you, the Russians have pointed out, and maybe we'll get to this, Eric, if you're going to move on to advanced technology. The Russians are trying a lot of interesting different approaches. So they have a nuclear icebreaker fleet, which is an unbelievable strategic advantage in an Arctic that's become, let's say, very important for moving around energy security and military security. And the reactors that they put in the icebreakers, they're now experimenting with putting on land. So they're already building them on an assembly line for icebreakers. Why not put them on land or in a barge? There's a barge-based nuclear power plant in operation in Siberia that's powering new mining efforts and providing steam, heat for hot water, and electricity to the extreme Arctic far east north of Siberia. That is making very clear that there are ways to be using nuclear energy that we have not begun to scratch the surface on here in the West.
Let's move on now to talk about small modular reactors next. But first, I need to read another message from our sponsor, Van Eck, who generously agreed to host both tonight's debate and our upcoming event on August 14th with doctors Nick Turan and Jake DeWitt. AI, streaming, cloud computing, it's all hungry for power. And guess what's quietly making it all possible? Nuclear energy. Van Eck's NLR ETF is your gateway to the future of energy, with exposure to uranium miners, utility companies, and the service pros keeping the lights on and the servers humming. That sentence didn't make sense, but that's in the script. It's clean, it's reliable, and getting major support from governments around the globe. From data centers to global energy dependence, nuclear is having a serious moment. Don't miss it. Check out Van Eck's NLR ETF because future needs power. and smart portfolios need exposure. Visit vanek.com/NLRZH or simply look up the ticker NLR, that's November Lima Romeo, on the New York Stock Exchange. Okay, let's return to our debate. Without a doubt, small modular reactors are all the rage these days, but frankly, I think there's a lot more hype than reality to this. So I want to break this topic down word by word. What's so important about small and why is small better than large, especially considering that one of the biggest lessons of the first nuclear era was that economies of scale made big reactors much more economic than small ones. So why would a small reactor be better? And exactly what does this word modular mean in that context? Why is modularity important in the first place? And how do the various SMR designs being introduced into the market stand up against what we think are the important aspects of modularity and smallness of size? Why do I focus on all this? Because I'm convinced that everybody selling these things is selling completely different stuff that has nothing to do with each other just because the buzzword is hot. So let's start with Mark Nelson once again. Mark, what do they actually mean by the word modular exactly? Are we talking about the reactor as a module? Or are we talking about the module is built out of, or the reactor is built out of modules? Those are very different things. Why would smaller be better? And is there anything of substance to this whole SMR trend, or is it just marketing fluff?
So sometimes I find myself saying it's just marketing fluff, but I want to pick that apart and say where I think there's something interesting here, where I think there's value and something to learn. First of all, the small part. There are some grids that are just small. There are countries that, for very important energy security reasons, do not want their largest individual unit of turbine on the national grid to be beyond a certain percentage of the country's power because they're worried about the destabilizing effect of that one generator dropping off for any reason. So, for example, let's take the country of Estonia. It's basically a city-state of just over 1 million people, many of them in or around a single city, and it is on a land border and a water border with Russia, and they feel very insecure, and it's a difficult time and place for the Estonians. Well, they do not want, they only need a few gigawatts of power unless they have a sudden huge increase in load. So they don't want a 1 gigawatt reactor to dominate their grid and for the shutoff of that to cause power instability issues and the need to suddenly switch on way more imports from other countries. So in a country like Estonia, they are targeting 300 megawatt reactors because their grid is just smaller. There may have been some argument saying, well, it's actually cheaper because we're going to get the construction right. But almost anybody saying that the smaller reactor is cheaper construction, I do believe that doing large reactor construction properly will get you there. And you're going to have to learn to build your plant well and in large numbers with the same sort of skills and dedication to cost reduction that would make a large reactor work. Physically, small reactors are not that much smaller than the large reactors because as you shrink the the core of the reactor, you're making it much more neutron inefficient. I'm smoothing over a lot of technical things. Let me just say there are significant physical downsides to making a reactor core much smaller, and that our modern reactors got large in part because they were optimizing for extremely low costs and ultra reliable operation over long periods of time. And we did get there. We're not guaranteed to have that high performance if we change up the design significantly. You'd have to earn it. You'd have to show it over a long period of time. There'd be a long break-in period, probably. But if you need less power on the grid, you have to buy smaller reactors, no matter whether it's more or less expensive. If you need nuclear, if you want nuclear, and you don't have enough space on your grid, you may actually just need a smaller reactor or a very tight relationship with multiple countries or states working together to share single reactors, which does happen sometimes. So the small, I can buy it if your grid is small and you don't need the power and you've got to have multiple units. I will say there's a new argument coming for small from data center developers who say we want a combination of reactors that assures us that if we're building a bunch of expensive nuclear for a data center, we want to not have only half the data center size of the amount of reactors because we have 2 reactors and one's going down for refueling, and then we'd have to buy all the makeup power. So if you have 2 1 gigawatt reactors, 2 gigawatts of reactors, it's like 2 million people's worth of power, and you've got a data center there. If you have a 2 gigawatt data center and 2 reactors, that's say 93, 94% uptime between those 2 reactors. That may not be good enough for a data center that needs to be up 99.999% of the time. So you might be limited to a 1 gigawatt data center and 2 1 gigawatt reactors. So an argument I'm seeing increasingly, and I think I can be convinced, is that if you have a lot of smaller reactors and you stagger the refueling times, the minimum power your reactor fleet is providing is much higher if it's broken down into different chunks. We'll see how that goes, but certainly one of the companies I'm working with, Allo Atomics, that is their pitch. And they say, this is what we're hearing from the data centers themselves. If our customers are saying this, if our customers are demanding it, we're listening. So we'll see how that goes. But that is an argument for small that you don't often hear, that the minimum power in a chunk of reactors you control needs to be as high as possible, even if it's just a little bit below maximum power and you're building a lot of individual reactors in order to do it. But I will say that whenever people target that S in small and they don't know what they're talking about, they can get in big trouble. Here's an example. In Illinois, our governor arbitrarily decided that big nuclear was bad and small reactors are good. So he vetoed an overwhelmingly popular law getting rid of Illinois' dumb 1980s moratorium on building new power. And we're the most nuclear powered state we produce more nuclear power than any other state, and we're near the top in percentage of power. Chicago, where I'm sitting right now, is almost 100% nuclear from reactors of exactly the sort that is banned under the law. So the governor gets rid of this ban, he vetoes it, and he only accepts 300 megawatts or below. It's only now that someone told him that a lot of the leading 300 megawatt reactors are actually a little bit bigger than 300. Is that against the law? Is it not? He didn't realize that that was such an arbitrary cutoff that he's killing a lot of the candidates that would come build in Illinois just because of this arbitrary number that was a little too small. Also, a bunch of utilities that were terrified of nuclear have found themselves crawling back to nuclear because they're like, oh, it's just a little bit. It's just a little small, just a little baby bit of nuclear. But in fact, it turns out that with the AI boom, they need a lot. And if you use up a precious spot at an existing nuclear plant for a reactor that's physically as large as the large ones, but only makes a fraction of the power, that may not be a good use of space at nuclear plants. So in the case of that S, there's some stuff that's real and important and some stuff that's perhaps more hype than reality. On the M for modular, what that M really means in marketing language is that people had this vision of creating everything you need to make a reactor go in a big chunk of metal in a factory, moving it to site and plugging it in and calling that a module. In the old language of nuclear engineering, what they're really trying to sell is an integral reactor where everything you need except the generator itself is in one big container. But that giant container becomes a massive problem if it's big enough that it competes with the size of the very biggest parts from a traditional nuclear reactor while only making a fraction of the power. Even worse, your nuclear plant is only as modular as the plant itself is and the biggest module that goes into it. So if you have these integral reactor modules, think of a big can with a reactor and steam generators in it. All you have to do is link up a generator and run the steam through. If that sits in a building which itself is a mega construction project, you've changed things up to get almost no improvement. So if you build a giant big building to put a module in, then you're not able to make a business case that each module, can be placed in and you'll make it all up when you finally fill up the building. No, you're paying for a giant building that with all of the aircraft impact implications and the seismic, the earthquake protection implications without necessarily getting it back in any kind of other efficiencies. The other thing I have to say is we've always made the nuclear reactor parts in factories and then shipped them to site. That's not often been the huge problem. There's been integration issues. So if you're claiming we're going to integrate it all in a factory, then send it, now you're probably making severe limitations on how efficient the reactor can be if it's a small device with a small core. So a lot of different words out there. I will say that in the 90s, Japan was building ABWRs, advanced boiling water reactors, in 48 months from start of construction to commercial operation. These are 1,300 megawatt reactors, 1.3 gigawatts, and they were made in 48 months. I talked to one of the old engineers who had been there in the 90s, and I said, how on earth did you make a reactor that was 1,300 megawatts in 48 months? And he said, easy. It was the first design to take modularity seriously. So this is interesting. They meant modularity to mean constructing the entire building, the forms. They meant how the reactor went in modules, and they broke it down that way, thought of it that way, and planned the construction that way. Now, just because you plan it that way doesn't mean you're always going to get it that way. The AP1000s in Georgia at Vogel that went over budget, as you mentioned, Erik, that was supposed to be modular. But as an example, there was a big module that was supposed to be made under a factory roof, certified as correct, and shipped to site. Well, they forgot to see when they made this plan, could you actually get this module to the location? Turns out it was too big for road, too big for rail. They meant to take it in on a barge, but they didn't get the environmental permit to dredge the Savannah River and get it in. They had to take it apart and rebuild it on the site. So just because you claim it's modular doesn't mean it's modular in the sense that helps get the minimum construction time per unit of energy eventually. And you also, just because you break it into modules and say it's modular, does not mean it works for every site. You've got to check that in advance. When I think that we can do nuclear better in the future, it's partly by learning these incredibly painful lessons and being absolutely adamant that we look for similar problems and solve them before they start.
And now for what everybody's been waiting for on ZeroHedge, Doomberg on S&M. No,
Yeah.
small and modular.
Small and modular, yeah. I mean, not much to add to what Mark said. I agree with it. I think there's a distinction between small and micro, and I think there are interesting applications for micro nuclear that are distinct from the types of nuclear that we've been discussing before. It was alluded to earlier. Russia's fleet of nuclear-powered icebreakers, which is actually quite impressive, and then these floating power plants that Russia is developing using similar technologies. There's all manner of interesting use cases for distributed nuclear where cost perhaps might not be as important as reliability and accessibility. You can think about the development of energy and mineral resources in remote areas and so on. And the only other thing I think I can add is the generation of steam is one of these interesting things that if you're not familiar with heavy industry, you might not realize how important it is. But humanity emits as much carbon generating steam for industrial purposes than it burns in the transportation sector, both automotive and aviation combined. And today, a lot of that steam is co-generated with electricity using natural gas as the fuel, and the sort of standard older generation nuclear technology really can't produce a sufficient amount of steam at a sufficient temperature to be industrially interesting. Whereas some of the more advanced designs get you into that realm, not quite as good as natural gas, but good enough for a lot of the base of the pyramid of steam production. And so you could imagine a use case where small or large micro-reactors are distributed in these brownfield heavy industrial sites that are already sort of well secured, and you would produce both electricity for site use and steam as well. But having said that, the advantage of doing so doesn't justify doing it because the main advantage is you're kind of doing it carbon-free. Natural gas is plentiful, it's cheap, it does the job well today. The plants are already well designed. But if you truly cared about carbon emissions, and to be clear, I don't particularly, and you were forced to figure out a way to abate global carbon emissions, that sort of high temperature steam wedge in the classic McKinsey cost curve of carbon abatement is there to be had, and advanced nuclear designs, which don't have to be small, by the way, but there's a world where that technology could be made to work in that wedge of carbon emissions that we are currently burning predominantly natural gas to achieve the stated objective of a combination of steam and electricity. So that's the only thing I would add. Again, to reemphasize, I'm actually quite interested in micro nuclear reactors. The the U.S. aircraft carriers, that are sailing all around the world with no need to refuel for years and years at a time. Go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, just gonna say those wouldn't count as micro. Those are a few hundred megawatts. Those are beasts. So a lot. I just wanted to say,
Sure.
micro. There's a debate about where micro starts. I think everybody agrees 5 megawatts and below is micro.
Sure.
There's some debate about whether 10 megawatts is that micro. Is that the S in small? But just know that so here's the thing. The US had to experience through just trying it where the cutoff was, at least for that time at Navy, where too small was too small in terms of the reactors. As it happened, the cutoff was at destroyers. So they decided destroyers that were nuclear powered were more trouble than they were worth, and better to just fuel them with good old fashioned, ship oil. And instead, what you're going to do is have the reactors just on the subs where it's an imperative because you're under the water, unlimited range. It doesn't matter how much it costs. You just got to use nuclear, or the aircraft carriers, these floating cities where you're using power plants that are sufficiently large. Would also note that the aircraft carriers, the iceberg propulsion systems are up near that category, tens of megawatts. Yeah. Not many people are definitely calling those micro. But I will say that the floating barge reactor was supposed to replace an actually existing micronuclear modular plant, these mini Chernobyl reactors deep in the Arctic, up at Bilibino nuclear plant. That's actually below 10 megawatts. So that really was micronuclear on land. But what they discovered was once they got the floating nuclear reactors that were bigger, they just took all the extra energy and said, that's good. We don't actually want to shut down the little power plant. So micronuclear still exists. The micro plants are going to be very interesting, perhaps essential for space colonies, maybe some rockets and satellites that are sent out. But they tend to be the ones that's seeing proposed that are going to get raced into production, or at least raced into testing next year under President Trump's mad rush towards nuclear. Those are going to be about the 1 megawatt level.
Mm-hmm.
I have a very different perspective on what's important about small and modular. And I want to be clear that what I'll describe is my opinion. I'm not trying to tell you this is what the people in the nuclear industry mean when they say small and modular. Quite to the contrary, I'm saying this is what the people in the nuclear industry are missing when they talk about small and modular. I think, and I'm going to start with modular. There's two kinds of modular that people need to distinguish, but they don't. One kind of modular is what Mark talked about. You want to build a nuclear reactor rather than building it out of bespoke, custom-made parts. You're going to make it out of parts that were pre-manufactured in a factory someplace. So the reactor gets built from modular components. The Westinghouse says the big advantage of this is now they can build a reactor in only 4.5 years. So now Westinghouse can do what the Koreans could do without anything being modular. So what? I don't think that ever mattered. What I think is much more important about modularity is the idea that the entire reactor is a module. Now, an example of a company that got this idea is NuScale. They said the reactor is a module, but we're going to build a 3-reactor version of our plant, a 5-reactor version of our plant. I don't know how many others they had. The point was there's one assembly line for making the reactor modules. You can combine multiple reactors to get a bigger plant, small number of reactors to get a smaller plant. They're designed to hook together like Lego blocks. That idea has not really existed in the nuclear industry previously. I think it needs to. I think that's more important than the other kind of modular. NuScale did that, but they were hoping to get, and then the other, I'll come back to NuScale in a minute, but let me go to small. Why is small important? Because I contend what matters is that you can build nuclear cost effectively in a gigafactory someplace, and that means you got to deliver it to where it's going to be used. One way to do that, as Mark described already, as Nick Turan will argue in favor of on August 14th at our next event, you could build entire nuclear power plants on a barge in a shipyard someplace, where you have a gigantic nuclear shipyard that does nothing but build nuclear power plants in a shipyard. and then you just tow them around the world and park them wherever you're going to use them. Well, that means your nuclear power plants are floating on barges. I hope there's no tidal wave coming. It's an interesting idea. Another way to solve this problem is design nuclear reactors small enough to where the entire nuclear reactor fits in a shipping container. Then you could take the entire shipping container and send it someplace. I think everybody agrees that nuclear reactors can be built in shipping containers. There's a huge amount of disagreement about how much power capacity you can safely put into a shipping container. A company that I've invested in claims that they've designed a 100 megawatt thermal, so that's equivalent to about 35 megawatts electric, nuclear reactor in a single shipping container. Mark Nelson and Nick Turan and everybody else I know who's a nuclear PhD says that's impossible. Totally, completely, laws of physics say it can't happen. I'd really like to get one of these debates together where we get the CTO of Copenhagen Atomics up against maybe a Nick Turan to talk about that, because I really, really want to know how big of a module we can transport in a container. And this is a question I've been dying to ask Mark Nelson. I know you think it's impossible, but would you agree with me in the hypothetical scenario that it really is possible, that Copenhagen Atomics really did invent a way to safely build a nuclear reactor of 100 megawatts thermal in a shipping container? If it turns out that that really is true, I think it's a game changer, because it means that you can make entire modular power plants where you just ship everything in containers and they get assembled like IKEA furniture, where you literally put the power plant together in 4 or 5 weeks, not 4 or 5 years, because it's just components that bolt together. Would you agree, Mark, that if they really do have 100 megawatts in a shipping container, it changes everything?
So 100 megawatt thermal. So if they're trying to say it's high temperature and that maybe that's a separate module or so. Here's the thing. A lot of people are claiming that the reactor is in the shipping container and there's some relationship to being in a shipping container and being able to operate, maybe even moving it back from site. Just the basic physics of a nuclear reactor is that we don't have to think that much about radiation in nuclear plants most of the time, because it's self-contained within a giant core. And not even a giant core, it's just you're making a huge amount of power. Almost all the powerful radiation coming out from that power is hitting the internals of the reactor core with replaceable parts that are absorbing the damage, fuel that's absorbing the damage, and then you take the fuel out and put it in. When people are talking about extremely small devices that are going to run and have nuclear reactions, what Nick Turan's obsessed with, he says, show me the shielding. Already we've got a situation where, depending on where you put the shielding, some of the micro-reactors that have come in shipping containers or portable containers that the military's done in the past, they had to tell planes even miles above them, don't fly here. There's an operating reactor and it's blasting radiation above you in like a cone shape, and you've got to stay away. Also, depending on how much shielding you put on the ground, if you're operating these reactors, you're just blasting the ground with radiation. Now, I'm not a radiophobe, but it is real. And if you're going to operate, maintain, and be around devices, that honestly is what took down a lot of these mobile reactors. They were just a massive pain in the ass, spitting out particles everywhere, irradiating things. You had to wait before servicing them. When anything went wrong, you just had to shut it off and wait for when it was safe enough to handle. If we're talking about Copenhagen's design, I mean, I wish them well. They've pushed forward the nuclear conversation in Denmark, and that's really important because it's a key rich country that's been pushing wind power nearly exclusively for decades in the European Union. So I'm happy for Copenhagen Atomic being part of the changing conversation that's taking over the energy debate in Denmark. But just because you can ship some aspects of a full plant in a shipping container probably doesn't end up meaning what people want it to mean when you actually have to operate, maintain, and move, or even, God forbid, decommission a power plant.
Okay, so in any case, to close on this point of small and modular, why I think modular is important is that you hook a lot of small nuclear reactors together to make one large nuclear power plant. So we can make large nuclear power plants of any size all around the world just by ganging together some number of smaller reactors. The only reason that it would make any sense to do that, because larger reactors would be more economic, the only reason it makes sense to do that is if making them modular means that you can make them small enough that they ship much more efficiently and much more cost effectively. What you can fit into a shipping container can go from point A to point B a hell of a lot cheaper than deck cargo on a ship, and a hell of a lot cheaper than something that has to be custom built on site, as you described earlier. So that's, to me, why small and modular is important. Set the stage for being able to have a gigafactory someplace that builds entire nuclear power plants that get shipped off all around the world, set up and put together. In order to do that, that's why I think we need small and modular. And I don't think I'm certain that the nuclear industry is not interpreting small and modular the way I think they should, according to me. So they failed. There may be other people with other opinions. Let's move on to the next topic, which I want to talk about, which is advanced nuclear fission, starting with what do they even mean by advanced? Because that by itself, it's different things to different people. Usually people are talking about reactors that are cooled by something other than water. Sometimes by advanced, they also mean fast neutron designs that use fuel more efficiently and produce less spent nuclear fuel waste. Many people, myself included, have argued that we've known for a long time about better nuclear reactor designs that were developed mostly in the 1960s that never got commercialized due to politics. So there's some of us who think that this nuclear renaissance should focus mostly on commercializing those advanced nuclear fission designs. But a widely held counter-argument, Mark Nelson is the global commander in charge of that view, is, at least in my perception, is that no, we should stick with what frickin' works. What we know, what's proven to work. We should build the things that we've already got experience with, and we shouldn't be doing science projects to invent new technology that's unproven at a time when the world urgently needs more electricity. Obviously, good arguments on both sides of that. Mark, take it a little further. Why do you feel that we shouldn't be getting too concerned with all of these Generation 4 advanced designs, and we should just focus on what we already know works?
Well, Eric, first I got to say, I changed my life direction and got into nuclear because of the beauty and purity of the vision of advanced nuclear. That nuclear was amazing, but unloved and unappreciated, but it could be even more amazing and become loved and appreciated if we change certain aspects of the design. I even went off to Cambridge University, excited to do my thesis on one of these incredibly beautiful and as of yet unimplemented advanced reactor designs. It is the design that not long after I went to write my master's thesis on it got adopted as the TerraPower Bill Gates reactor. They pretty much adopted wholesale a fascinating design that I, as an engineer, cannot wait to see implemented. So why is it that I could change so much that you announced that I'm the global leader of the nuclear haters, the advanced nuclear haters? And I've had people call me anti-nuclear in the last week on social media. Let me just say, I want to see these reactors built. I want to see them implemented. Where I get worried is where people who are, say, investing in these or backing these or promoting these have never touched a nuclear plant in their life, have never been to one, have never been around one, but are dumping some of their money into policy changes that may not end up helping them at all, but may damage the approaches that we know work in nuclear. So for the moment, the NRC is under brutal attack by people who think that that's the holdup, even though the NRC can absolutely license any array of reactors. And even more, most of the advanced nuclear people are finding ways to march forward without even having to go through the NRC necessarily. So like the debate that you're going to have, Oklo, they had big problems with the NRC. They worked them out and they're advancing quickly. And I don't think they like the idea that the NRC is being attacked, even though all of us love that the NRC is extremely serious about reform, and it's getting to be so fast that it's too fast. It's no longer on the critical path for a bunch of the advanced reactor people. So again, why am I worried about this stuff? It's not just the policy attacks that I think may slow down all nuclear in the misguided attempt to speed up some specific advanced designs. It's that The reason why a lot of these designs were left behind is because they involve very serious engineering or economic trade-offs. Some of those we may have workarounds for. In some cases, we may have advanced some ways in technology or in fuel supplies. We've gotten such bigger availability of fuels, and uranium's cheaper and more available than we thought it would be, that it alleviates some of the problems that those reactors are going to solve, but it might also lower the cost to attempt those if that's something we think we can pursue. I will say that a lot of nuclear excitement is based on the extraordinary low cost, high reliability performance of the designs that ended up winning. And a lot of the so-called advanced designs are efforts to bring back designs that were not so good and not so promising on the first blush. They might be, again, they might do a good job. And I love exploring this technology, but people who think that there will be no trade-offs or no breaking in period or learning period with advanced reactors, that just isn't borne out by history. Let's look at Russia and China. We've already done it to some extent earlier in this show. Russia and China do not have the NRC telling them what they can't do. Now, they both have regulators. I would argue that those regulators can, in some ways, be more strict, especially in China, than the NRC, and less reasonable if there's a political dictate not to allow certain things in nuclear. They're not going to allow it regardless of whether it's safe. That's the downside of a nuclear regulator in a country like that. However, China and Russia don't have anyone telling them what they can't do in nuclear. They both have multiple departments, companies, agencies exploring lots of different things. And they're both aggressively building, and in the case of Russia, selling for export the old, boring, standard things. On one hand, because that's what customers are ordering. On the other hand, because Russia, which operates an array of different reactors and reactor types, they sell the thing that produces the cheapest electricity when you include the cost to build it. So the Russians have a sodium fast reactor program. It's cool. I mean, I definitely can see some arguments for improving this or that, and maybe it would drop the price. But the Russians are not expanding it rapidly into a commercial program to displace their traditional reactors because it doesn't make power as cheaply. They might work out the bugs. They might cancel their traditional plants and do just their advanced plants. Also, the Russians are not sitting still. They're working on a lead fast reactor. That's pumping heavy molten lead around. There are various things that are easier, some things that are harder if you use lead. The Soviets once had a lead cooled fast reactor submarine, and it was a pain in the ass, and they shut it down. But it might be better on land, might be better with a different approach. Either way, they're working on a lead fast reactor for a Siberian chemical combine. That's amazing, but they're not like suddenly ordering a bunch, canceling their traditional, and selling it overseas. It's a very interesting project that I'm going to be watching like a hawk. And there are a number of startups across the West in multiple countries working on lead fast reactors, but that's not the same as being able to just assert that it will displace or be better than the traditional ones. Certainly, you should not shut down any viable pipelines for making the traditional ones for the uncertain future advantages of the advanced. Some of the advanced reactors we know are going to be trouble. Amazon chose the X-Energy reactor for various reasons, and one thing that I heard from Amazon and X-Energy people is, no, look at the one in China. They're confident in it, so we are. Well, China is half true. China has built reactors kind of like this. The reactors are performing so poorly that they're derating them to try to make them look a little better. They're saying, no, they're smaller. They're going to run them at lower power. That makes it look a little better. They're really struggling because developing this type of reactor is so hard that that's what got it canceled repeatedly in the West. There wasn't enough willpower, maybe we could have solved those issues, but to just assert that it's better because it's different, that just isn't borne out by history as much as I'm excited to see those reactors come to fruition. It's why a group like Amazon, if they're smart, they're going to be looking at a range of different efforts in case that reactor type doesn't work out quite so well. I have an immense amount of respect for the scientists and engineers working on these. There's a reason why whenever any one of these advanced companies goes belly up, people swoop in to hire the people, get some of the technologies if they're still viable or can be split apart into profitable businesses, because the science is cool, the engineering is cool, but you cannot assert that it's better because it's different, especially when almost every single reactor we're seeing out there was one of an abandoned line of development previously. I am an investor and advisor to some of these advanced reactors, and I love the sector, and I would love to be proven wrong. I will go on a giant crow eating tour and humiliate myself before the world. And I'm going to keep supporting some of these efforts. But to assert that they're going to be better because they're different is a very flawed argument. And I think we've got to be very cautious when evaluating claims from reactors that don't exist yet.
Outstanding, Mark. I'm hoping that we have not just had a technical glitch, because position of Mark and Doomberg on my screen just reversed and I lost our producer. So hopefully I'm still connected and everything is good. I want to move back to Doomberg. The topic at hand is advanced reactors and their benefits, but I think Mark has also brought up an important second topic, which is the Nuclear Regulatory Commission in the United States. Mark just had a tweet out, or a post on X, I should say, because that's the new thing we call tweets, really with some strong praise for the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, for the role that it plays. I disagree pretty strongly with Mark. I think you do too, Doomberg. So let's tag team and beat the crap out of him.
Well, let me just start with the advanced stuff. My personal position is very similar to Mark's in that well-built old designs are so superior to all other forms of primary energy that any distraction from just doing more of that is counterproductive. And to the extent that there are people selling sort of false dreams and promises around quote unquote advanced nuclear, and could almost certainly incinerate a significant amount of excited investor capital in early phase type developments, could in the long term be counterproductive to getting more stable, well understood, relatively easy to build nuclear online as quickly as possible. To your question about the NRC, I must confess that Mark and I have been engaging offline. We're actually, I would say, friends in real life. I hope Mark agrees with that characterization.
Certainly my favorite chicken.
Yes. And Mark, I think, has convinced me on one really important point, which is the NRC has played a pivotal role in providing the legal framework and certainty that has allowed investing in nuclear to occur in the United States. And second, the NRC's posture vis-a-vis the industry is nothing more than the expression of the politics of the day. So if presidents and senators and congresspeople are very much against the deployment of nuclear power, the NRC responds to such proddings. And if, let's say, the new Trump administration is very much for the development of nuclear power, the NRC will work with that administration to make the changes necessary to see that rollout occur. And having thought about that point, well, those 2 points combined, but the second point in particular, that's actually kind of nice to see in an administrative bureaucracy, that it's actually responsive to the politics of the day. And then the final point that Mark makes, and I would obviously allow him to make his own points for him, but having heard his views and read his tweet, and it'll always be tweets to me, and it'll always be Twitter, I think the last thing this renaissance needs is to be choked out by the time needed to respool an entire regulatory framework that is bankable. And one thing that resonated with me when Mark, I think I would admit, convinced me of his argument, is that bankability is really important for large projects. And what do I mean by bankability? You can get it funded. So take, you want to build an LNG export terminal. What makes that bankable? Well, the design has been built before. The engineering firm that is doing it has built 5 LNG export terminals successfully on time. And you've contracted your cargoes to the point where it's highly unlikely that the bank's debt won't be repaid. Bankability really matters to getting projects funded and built. And the stability and sort of immunity that the NRC has provided the nuclear industry, I think, has been important, and was underappreciated by me And I will say that we have written very critically about the NRC in the past, and we will probably in the next few weeks begin to correct the record, given the new information that Mark has relayed to me, which I think is important, as advocates and analysts, that one be open-minded to new views. And, when it comes to nuclear, Mark's views are among the highest that I respect. And so, Mark, maybe you could follow up, but I hope I've characterized your views accurately.
No, it's pretty close. Here's the thing. I'm already being attacked by saying, "Oh, I'm just worshiping secret nuclear knowledge of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission nerds," or that I'm against getting to try out things. No, a number of the startups I work with are figuring out channels either to go extremely fast, so fast that despite the NRC being there, they're not worried because they're going to get their side of the issue done so quickly that they don't see the NRC's time spent on their application as being part of the holdup. Or they're going entirely around the NRC, and NRC's just fine with that. They say, if you want it licensed this way, here's our ways. They're going, say, to the Department of Energy, or they're going to work with the Department of Defense, each of which may not have much experience licensing reactors, but are so eager to get it right, and so eager to try, that there's a great spirit of innovation happening both in and outside the NRC. The bigger thing is this. I do not agree that the NRC is holding things up. The NRC cannot force utilities to apply for a license or to decide to invest in nuclear. The NRC cannot force utilities not to close their plants early. The NRC cannot force politicians not to go against war. They just make an extremely durable barrier where the politicians cannot use claims about reactor safety legally to shut down the plants, even if they try to petition the public or try to control other commissions that the NRC doesn't have any power over. Like, for example, with Diablo Canyon, the NRC was going to issue the license. The NRC said, it looks fine to us. It doesn't matter how angry it makes Californians. This reactor looks fine. And outside the NRC, people tried to use and leverage claims about the NRC to shut down the nuclear plant, even though the NRC was totally fine with it. And as soon as the license was reapplied for, NRC sped it right through and gave the license. NRC has just done something it's never done. It's allowed Palisades nuclear plant to restart. Why had they never not allowed it? Because no one had applied for it. The NRC cannot force you to restart your reactor. So there's a lot of claims being made that the NRC did this or did that. When the NRC just sits there, they can only work on what people apply to it. Another claim people make about the NRC is that the NRC wants to, stretch out applications and run up billable hours. The billable hours, NRC is required by law to charge that. That can be changed by law. The NRC doesn't even necessarily get that money. That money goes to Congress, basically goes to the budget, and then NRC has to beg for that money back on the budget. It may not get it. So yeah, NRC is also vulnerable to, if the world is there's an anti-nuclear sentiment, that makes things slower through the NRC. But the NRC has repeatedly and regularly been at least as pro-nuclear as the states that are trying to, get nuclear. And rarely is the NRC ever more anti-nuclear than states trying to get rid of the nuclear. It's almost always approved the licenses, the amendments, the arguments from engineers that have allowed nuclear plants to keep running even against political opposition in the US. The NRC, if it's not, I just can't abide by this claim that that's the thing slowing it down. But I will say that I'm not worried about people making new reactors and killing themselves or making a lot of radiation. It might happen. In the early days of messing around with reactors, some people died. They're, brave young men. Hopefully they got good lead caskets and tombstones, and I feel bad for their families. That's not my worry here. I honestly think that the urge for nuclear is strong enough that I'm not as much worried about losing, say, public trust or the mantle of trust or the public license. I think there's a very strong argument made by other people who agree with me on the NRC that we might lose that public license. But I think there are ways to get that back with great marketing or whatever. What I hate the idea of is, though, losing the NRC's legal shield that makes nuclear plants bankable and doing it on behalf of prototype science experiments that would not barely be slowed down at all, if at all, by the NRC staying the way it is today. So there's my big beef, where this is little c conservative, where the NRC is serving a role. I don't see it blocking. I don't see the justifications being given as valid. And I don't accept that if you don't see a downside at breaking the NRC, I don't trust you in getting rid of the NRC. And look, I've been called anti-nuclear this week. I've been said that I worship regulation. None of that's true. And I'm not worried. It's not meltdowns I'm worried about. What I'm worried about is people with unlimited money to file lawsuits to block nuclear, even if they lose. They don't lose quickly enough to not stop the project. That was in the bad old days when the NRC was just getting going. There was an explicit legal strategy across the nation to sue utilities and challenge whether the reactor was going to be safe enough. Who was the authority? Well, the NRC, but the NRC was just getting going. Were their rules up to date? There was endless haggling over that. Well, the NRC, for better or worse, caught up. The rules have been pretty steady for quite a long time. We know what's buildable. We know what's bankable. The NRC doesn't even guarantee that your reactor's a good design. It just says if you build it, if you somehow build it, we say that it's legally called safe. And that's a protection where you're guaranteed to be able to start it up if you built it like what you said to the NRC. When I talk to people who were part of that big crisis at Vogtle and got the plant done, they say that maybe the NRC could have been a little more cooperative, or a little more responsive, or maybe the NRC could have anticipated some issues. But then they said whenever we needed something from the NRC, whenever we changed the design on the fly, did it something different way, the NRC was there to approve the changes really quickly. If you're a purist, if you're an ideologue coming at this saying all regulation is bad, well, I have bad news. We live in a society, and we're not in a free-for-all, like feudal world where whoever is the local strongman with the most knights wins. We hash things out in court. We do things with lawyers, for better or worse. I'm not a lawyer, and I'm not happy when I have to use lawyers. I hate it. But in a nation of laws, the NRC is a dramatic reduction in the legal bullshit around nuclear at the price that they are regulation and need to be respected. So I think that price is worth paying, considering the certainty that they give nuclear projects, at least on the legal side. They cannot stop your project from being a boondoggle. They can just assure that legally there's no defense by people suing your project to stop you from running because they say it's unsafe. Okay, I'll get off my soapbox.
Wow. Well, Mark, I very much appreciate and respect your passion and belief in this. Couldn't disagree with you more. I am convinced that the NRC was created in 1974 for a very specific reason, and that reason was to make goddamn sure that nuclear energy could never be cost competitive with coal and gas. And I think they've done a fabulous job of carrying out that mission, and they've got a hell of a lot of blood on their hands. And I say blood on their hands in the direct accusation of, I think the NRC is responsible for the loss of human life in the form of a whole bunch of unnecessary coal mine accidents that never had to happen if we had our shit together with nuclear energy and we didn't have the NRC in the way. Needless to say, that's I respect your view and hope that I'm wrong about that. But I think we need to get the government out of the way of progress and get our act together. As far as the advanced technology is concerned, I agree with you that we need to take what already works and focus on that first. But I'm also convinced that we cannot make nuclear cost less than coal until we adopt different technologies. I don't think light water reactors can ever cost less than coal, including CapEx and OpEx. I don't see it ever happening. I think the new reactor technologies offer that promise, but I agree with you. They're not ready yet. So we got to do two things in parallel. One is roll out what we already know. It's going to be expensive. Two is we got to design something that's cheaper. And I think we have to do both.
Well, we finally got to the debate phase of this discussion, so that's good.
What do you what do you want to add on either of those topics, Doomberg? Because
I'll let you guys duke it out. I think my personal experience, again, the whole bankability question is actually real and important. But I think we've expressed the full range of views.
Well, and I actually think that what you just said is really important, because one thing that I will say about my view of the nuclear future, I don't think it's a nuclear problem. It's a capital formation problem that we have to solve. The issue is that it's relatively easy to raise billions or tens of billions of dollars to build something that's already proven and known to work, and there's no question.
And
When
for
you
which
talk
there's legal protection, which is Mark's point. Yeah, go ahead.
Yep. When you're talking about billions with a B of dollars for speculative technology risk, we're going to develop and design a better kind of nuclear reactor that's never been done before. And we've got to then figure out how we're going to mass produce it in a factory to make it cost effective. I see a very clear path to solving the world's energy problems. I'm convinced it's possible. I'm convinced we can make it nuclear centric, make it cost less than energy from coal. It's really fantastic. It's really awesome. It's really great. It's going to cost about 25 billion with a B to work this all out and get it ready to go, including building the gigafactory that's going to make the reactors on a fully robotic assembly line. If anybody watching has the 25 billion with a B of speculative technology risk capital that wants to make that bet, give me a call. The point is, the industry is not prepared to do that. Only major government initiatives can spend tens of billions of dollars on a speculative risk. There is no way in the capital formation system to do that in the private sector, unless somebody like Elon wants to take that huge risk that he took with buying X and just say, I'm going to personally risk tens of billions of dollars if this doesn't work out. Who's going to step up and do that in order to develop advanced nuclear?
Well, Eric, okay, so then if we're connecting it to the past thing, what is it there that you think that the NRC would be blocking or stopping if you're making, there are reactors that the NRC licenses that the other regulatory agencies in Europe or around the world then pick apart and find all these things wrong. I'm not saying I agree with them. It's just thinking that of the NRC as the strictest or whatever. There's plenty of regulatory systems that would not have been ready to even approve the AP1000 because they were taking a radical approach to safety compared to other reactors. They were reducing safety systems. They were getting rid of safety and protection systems, making an argument that if you did the math and you had this new passive safety feature, you remove the need for this or that system. And therefore, it wasn't the regulator greedily taking all the safety and just making sure that you're like 1,000 times safer. It's more like you making the argument that because you've made some changes, you can strip out systems, radically reduce the number of valves, the amount of concrete, the amount of steel, and still make the same amount of power in a tiny plot of land. So the NRC is able to do that. Also, there are multiple other ways to test and license your prototype reactor. So in your 25 billion gigafactory case, like it's not really the NRC that would be stopping you in, or if, let's say, slowing you down or whatever. You're talking like a multi-million-dollar maybe delay, or if you're talking time, or if you're talking extra cost to submit the paper, like it's not clear what it is on this gigafactory timescale, because you wouldn't build the gigafactory unless you knew each individual reactor would work. You don't build the gigafactory for the Raptor engine until you like know that you have a working engine design. So if the NRC is not really stopping your prototype, then what's the need to attack it to know? And in fact, I would switch it around. If you're asking for 25 billion with a B, you'd want to make sure there's an environment where the scared, cowardly, dumb money that goes in to do debt financing, they don't want equity, they just want their money back. They need to know that some lawyers aren't going to come along and delay it so long it destroys your project, which is the problem that the NRC effectively was born into. There were successful legal challenges to the authority of the Atomic Energy Agency that were successfully delaying, sometimes for years at a time, construction projects. That was the world that the NRC was born into.
So I think the point that you're missing, Mark, is the way that the NRC has prevented for the last 40 years a whole bunch of people from building advanced reactors is just by existing. What happens is smart people, and I'm not making this up, I've talked to several heavyweight private equity, billionaires in the world of energy investing who've all told me the same thing. Yeah, that thorium stuff, the molten salt reactors, yeah, that is really cool, but nobody in their right mind would invest in that because you're talking about the most regulated industry on earth. You're trying to introduce a new fuel, a new moderator, and a new coolant all at the same time. and you're dealing with a bureaucracy that doesn't know how to regulate that, no way. Nobody wants to invest in that. The way nuclear has always been done is the national laboratories figure out the technology. Once they figure it out, they tell the private contractors, build another one of these things. Everybody feels that the NRC only knows how to oversee that process where U.S. national labs figure out some new technology. They say, build this, and contractors go build it. The idea of, yes, the law would allow that anybody who wants to could have proposed to take that 1960s molten salt reactor design, the thermal spectrum molten salt breeder reactor. They could have proposed that to the NRC back in the 80s if they wanted to. They knew better than to do that, Mark, because they knew it was a waste of time.
So
and
now
capital.
you've got to how do I disprove something that people didn't go for? I'm sympathetic to it. I'm not dismissing it out of hand.
Find
like
your
I'm a
own
debate school
billionaire who
student.
says my billionaire is wrong.
But a bunch of the billionaires are funding companies that are working extremely rapidly with multiple pathways in and around the NRC who did not join the lawsuit against it. There's a billionaire funding Kairos. Kairos is very happy. In fact, they're getting licensed from the NRC almost too fast to be able to keep that on the critical path. They're getting them very, very, very rapidly and are working through multiple pathways there. Bill Gates is funding TerraPower. That's a reactor now that was
Mark,
very well along its way working with the NRC back in the day in the 90s when it was canceled by Clinton for reasons that had nothing to do whether it was or wasn't licensable by the NRC. I just wanted to say I don't necessarily agree with you on your billionaires looking for a path other than the NRC.
Mark, you've made this point to me yourself before. Everybody who's doing something really cool with advanced nuclear, such as Terra, it's all the pet projects of billionaires who said, yeah, okay, maybe the capital formation process is not really inclined to put money into this thing because the NRC's in the way. Screw it. I'm a billionaire. I'm going to do this because I feel passionately about it. Bill Gates puts together Terra. You've got Kairos. All of these advanced nuclear projects are the pet projects of billionaires because the established capital formation system won't invest in this stuff. That's the problem we got to fix. Doomberg.
I'm just
the word
here.
Of wisdom that breaks that awkward moment of silence is.
No, I'm just reflecting on something that you said, and I've repeated a few times, which I find interesting, and maybe because I think we could probably agree that the two of you are going to agree to disagree on this topic. You keep saying that we need to get
Mark and I do that from time to time.
Yeah, that's fine.
It's what keeps it fun. We can respect each other.
100%. You've said multiple times during this debate that we need to get nuclear to be cheaper than coal. It already is, and I would argue by a reasonably wide margin. The definition of coal and the cost of coal is not a static point source. It actually depends on how strongly you wish to abate the pollution concerns that come with coal. And when you build the most green, to use a terrible word, but when you build a coal plant that has all of the bells and whistles vis-a-vis pollution control, mercury and SOx and NOx and so on, and really like the only thing you're emitting into the atmosphere is CO2, that's not cost competitive with nuclear. And the only reason why the fleet of coal power plants around the world is quote unquote cheap is because the externalities of environmental degradation are not included in the cost to run and operate those facilities. Like China's not doing that. Of course, anybody who's been to China knows that PM 1.5 is the one metric that the Chinese Communist Party is deathly afraid of, and that's why the U.S. Embassy publishes it every day. This is the particulate matter of 1.5 in Beijing and Shanghai. And so if you were to truly build a coal plant to the environmental standards of a typical AP1000 or CANDU reactor, it would not be cost competitive with nuclear. And then on top of that, most of the cost in nuclear is up front. And so the marginal cost of nuclear once it's built is effectively free. I think I heard Mark quote $25 a kilowatt hour on Chris Kiefer's great podcast.
Megawatt hour.
Megawatt hour. Sorry.
Yeah.
We're almost 2 hours into it. So, but nuclear as it exists with the correct designs, with no, technology inventions needed or no radical designs, properly executed in the way that we've described, your own, Henry Ford Model T line assembly, take the surest thing that we know how to build, that we know is safe, and we just do that over and over and over again. Lord knows the federal government wastes scores of billions of dollars every year. Why not waste some of that producing immortal, safe, well-understood nuclear reactors? To me, the entire focus of the debate that you two just, engaged in, which I'm interested to listen to, is sort of proof that we are missing the sort of grander picture. It exists. Like, if aliens landed on Earth today, they'd be puzzled as to why it is we do anything basically other than, civilian nuclear energy to power the human endeavor. And so, I view all of this as just a giant distraction from what we should be doing, which is the 4 or 5 designs that are unbelievably safe, huge high energy density, reliable, maintainable, operable, and just do that over and over and over again at scale.
I'm all for that if it's economic, but I don't think that we can ultimately get to the scale that we need. And it's a question. Some people don't think that it's a good idea to try to do a mostly nuclear future. I believe in a nuclear future where most baseload energy comes from nuclear. Eventually, I think we could get to essentially all baseload energy comes from nuclear. If you have that vision, which means you want to get to 5 to 10 terawatts of nuclear generation capacity. And I say that loosely because that would be the electric equivalent. Not all of that nuclear capacity would be electric. Some of it would be process heat plants that are doing steel smelting and other things. But if you were trying to replace most energy with nuclear energy, you would need a whole lot of it. And I contend that you cannot scale the fuel cycle in order to support that with once through light water reactor technology. Now, Nick Turan made a very good point, which is he said, wait a minute, that doesn't mean you can't use light water reactors. You might need to add a few breeder reactors. You might need to get smarter about reprocessing, which we're not at all smart about from a policy standpoint. We could do a whole nother ZeroHedge debate about nuclear waste reprocessing because it's very badly misunderstood. But if we're trying to, if our goal is to make lots of nuclear, and I mean a lot, I don't think you can technically get there with light water reactors with a once through fuel cycle. It's got to be a different fuel cycle. Doesn't have to be a thorium fuel cycle, although thorium would solve it. But I think something like Terra's traveling wave reactor, which was trying to essentially create a breeder reactor that would use depleted uranium. That's the waste product that's left over from the enrichment process. We'd be able to use that waste product as fuel to run reactors for the next 100 years. We can also do this with thorium. So breeder reactors, getting onto that technology, I think is eventually necessary. And I think a big mistake people make is they say, don't worry about the cost of the fuel. The cost of the fuel is such a small percentage of the overall cost of nuclear energy. Stop worrying about the fuel cost. Well, that's true with the current generation technology. But if you look at what it would take to scale up to 5 to 10 terawatts of global generation capacity, all of a sudden the uranium gets a lot more expensive, the conversion and enrichment facilities get a lot more expensive, and suddenly a depleted uranium or thorium-based strategy that doesn't require all that enrichment, doesn't require all that uranium, is suddenly much more economic. And I think we have to get there eventually. I agree that we shouldn't stop and stop doing the good technology that's already in existence. But I think the technology already in existence costs too much. And I don't think it can ever cost less than coal. And yeah, what you said before, you're talking about if you were to try to build a green coal plant that didn't have emissions. I'm saying dirty coal that pollutes is cheaper than clean nuclear.
But
and
it's not in the long term, though. It's just not in the long term. Like, you actually have to pay to clean up the pollution. Somebody does. Maybe the coal operator doesn't. But those externalities are not included in the cost. And I don't mean carbon emissions. I'm being very clear. I'm talking about pollution, like SOx and NOx and mercury.
But the way that decisions are made to build things in the actual real world is based on dumb human beings making decisions where they say, we care about the cost of building the plant. We're not smart enough to think through what the cost of the operation of the plant is long term. We just know that building a nuclear reactor costs $20 billion. That's too much. We need something cheaper. Yeah. I think we can solve that problem with advanced technology, but it's going to take time that we can't wait for. So we got to do both.
I would say that to build advanced technology from start will cost just as much, because the cost has nothing to do with the technology and has everything to do with project management, culture, supply chain, all the things that Mark has talked about. And so, but
we've got to learn to build nuclear 100%, smarter.
But it doesn't require
can I say
technologies.
This, gentlemen?
Yeah.
If I can say this, if we have an open window now where AI dependent tech companies are going out and they're purchasing electricity contracts from existing reactors that are so high priced that if we were ready to go, that should be enough to get new reactors built. So we have our targets to hit. Meta just went out and bought 20 years of electricity from a 40-year-old reactor for just under $90 a megawatt hour. That should be enough. So the Chinese are building their plants for something like $55 a megawatt hour, depending on what we say their profit is or how long they want to pay it off or what their interest rate is. That is easily something that fits the price being paid for electricity by big tech today. And I'm not saying that we have to keep getting that amount or we won't build nuclear. If we prime the pump by a few very big orders for nuclear with this, people just have to have the power. And if you can build it on time and can guarantee a hyperscaler that it will be available in 5 years, then you would have a bunch of orders today. So we have a very clear target. We see what we're trying to get to. I'm involved with efforts both on what you might call the traditional managed better and the untraditional, starting from the beginning, racing ahead, small reactors that a smaller team can design and implement. Those are two different directions. Our target is very clear, $80 to $120 a megawatt hour to get moving. Let's see if we can do it.
Guys, we're coming up on 2 hours, and we got one more topic that we need to cover, because a lot of our viewers are scratching their heads saying, what is with these guys talking about all this nuclear fission BS? Haven't they heard the news? Commonwealth Fusion Systems has already announced that they're going to break ground in Virginia on a fusion power plant. So we're just a couple years away from having grid scale commercial fusion that's going to solve all of our problems. It's going to be much better. We don't need fission. I think the three of us probably agree that there's a little bit of reality missing from that message. Let's fill in some of the blanks, starting with Mark.
Sure. So I had the
please start by just defining what is this fusion thing? How's it different from fission?
Fusion is smashing together tiny atoms and getting energy out of the combination. Fission is breaking apart fat, chubby atoms and getting energy out of the split. The way I put it when I'm feeling mean is that fission is using the energy, the trapped energy of supernovas and neutron star collisions, and we're just cracking apart what the stars gave us. Whereas the other way around, we're taking extremely common, boring stuff and having to make our own stars. If you're making me choose between feasting off of the remains of old stars or making a star myself and running it like it's an engine here on Earth, I know which one I'm choosing. And that's the reason why only a few academic terms after pointy-headed professors discovered fission and made it happen in a lab, we had a working fission reactor controlled by people on a college campus. And 100 years after discovering fusion, we haven't even got to that point for fusion. So just wanted to say that one is using what nature gave us. The other is protesting that we aren't gods already and trying to become it here on Earth and making our own stars. So it's very interesting to try to make our own stars. And certainly there's a bewildering array of different approaches being taken. We've also seen that Helion, which has a power purchase agreement with Microsoft already, they are breaking ground. But I will tell you, I had the distinct, I wouldn't say pleasure, but the distinct experience of being at the world's top energy conference on stage, listening to the head of Commonwealth Fusion System lie about nuclear fission repeatedly to this huge audience of people who paid $13,000 a ticket to hear it. He was taking these awful engineering black holes that fusion has, and he was inverting them on their head and saying they're actually an advantage because fission. So he said, our reactors, the tiniest thing will shut off our entire plant. Well, that's bad. If you're making a power plant, you want it to keep running and making power. You don't want a mouse fart to like shut off a gigawatt plant that a society is relying on. That's bad, not good, especially if you're already 100 years in the hole on operating experience. He also said stuff like, our fuel is going to be so common, or it's in the universe or whatever. We've already established that the fuel cost of nuclear fission is not very high. Improving on that to slightly disagree with what you just said, does not get you very far on an economic basis, because that's not what's expensive about current nuclear. There may be other things connected to the fuel choice, but it's not the cost itself. The other thing is that fusion, if you're doing it well, is fundamentally involved with the same materials that are good for fusion bombs. Just like fission gets attacked for being connected to fission bombs, we could argue about that, but fusion is advancing, especially along the lines that are useful for fusion bomb programs and fusion bomb research. So like a lot of the fusion investment is going into things directly derived from our fusion bomb programs. I'm not saying that's a reason not to do it, but you shouldn't lie and say that fission is bad because there's a connection to fission bombs when you're making fusion that's connected to fusion bombs. Here's another thing, saying that fission has radioactive waste, but here in fusion, we don't. Yeah, well, here's something. In fusion, the entire device is being just blasted to death by particles. Now, some people are working on a different design where they substitute one ultra hard engineering problem for another ultra hard engineering problem. So let's put away those trade-offs and just say that if your device is being blasted to death by radioactive particles that are mostly blocked and internally absorbed by the nuclear system, I don't think you get to brag about not making nuclear waste. You're making giant amounts of irradiated waste, and it's your device itself. It's the walls of the device. It's insane to prey on people's ignorance and claim that you don't make radiation. Oh my God. The second people discover that fusion is, first of all, it's not there. Second, all these things are ultimately experiments. Third, people say, oh, it can turn off with a breath of air, like anything can shut off the plants. That's not reliability to me. And you're going to need a long time in operation to prove it's actually reliable. It uses fuel that can also go into fusion bombs. And then finally, you make radioactive stuff. It's called your device itself that's getting destroyed by your own reactions. All of these things are not reasons not to do fusion, but I sure as hell get mad when people lie in front of people who don't know any better and claim that's reasons to do fusion and not to do fission.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more, Mark, on that one. And it is just shocking to me that when you start with, well, we did this experiment to see if we could get a net positive energy result, a positive Q experiment, and we just tried and tried and tried, and we can't get it to work. We admit it, we can't produce net positive energy, but we are breaking ground on our first plant in Virginia.
So
wait a minute. Doomberg, help us with that one.
So Erik, actually, by coincidence, and we did not prepare this in advance, we actually wrote about Commonwealth on December 26th of 2024 under our masthead in a piece called Fit for Purpose. And the opening story for that piece was the purpose of a system is what it does moniker that is so commonly expressed in the software world. You have correctly articulated what Commonwealth did. There was a mini burst of hype because they signed a real estate deal. And in the fine print, they admitted that Q was not greater than 1. All they did was they signed a deal to basically build a fusion reactor at a certain location next to the governor, of Virginia, if it works. And then they went on a hype cycle. And they were on CNBC and Joe Kernan. We've linked to the interview in the piece. Joe Kernan said, so it's basically ready, and tossed it back to the CEO and founder of Commonwealth. And he kind of dodged that comment and then pivoted to another point that he wanted to make, which was the telling moment of the interview. The purpose of a system is what it does. And choosing my words carefully, our view is that the purpose of that entire affair was to raise funds for Commonwealth. Our big beef with fusion is it solves fake problems that don't exist. Nuclear waste is not waste. It's just future fuel with breeder reactors if you get smart about doing it, as you've articulated earlier, and you control, proliferation risk that comes with doing that. And meltdown risk is all but solved in advanced Gen 3 reactors, let alone, Gen 4. I mean, China has built, pebble reactors that are immune from, zero is an emotional number, all but immune from realistic scenarios for meltdown risk. And so you don't even need fusion. Again, the fusion is like the ultimate embodiment of advanced technology solves what we are currently missing from fission. No, we know how to do this. We can do it now. All money spent on fusion is going to be wasted if the goal is to replace fission. This gets back to, I'm all for fusion research in the name of science. And the layperson doesn't necessarily make a distinction between science and innovation, right? Science is the development of knowledge, and innovation is the extraction of value from science. We have all the science done for the value we need to extract from nuclear science. This is not on the critical path. And fusion attracts a certain sort of hucksterism that in the long term will be detrimental to the deployment of fission. And then the last thing I'll say is environmentalists love to point to fusion as a reason to not do fission, because fusion's a long ways away. It's a decades away, been a decade away for 50 years. And the moment fusion actually becomes commercially viable, those same environmental Malthusian oppositionalists will turn around and invent all kinds of reasons to oppose fusion. So the world will never build this. Never is a long time. If you ask me to bet my mortgage as to whether there will be a commercially operated fusion power facility in the next 25 years, I would bet no and sleep well.
Well, I certainly agree with that. In the interest of time, I'm just going to kind of incorporate by reference my Substack. I've got a Substack post that's titled Commercial Scale, Grid Scale Commercial Fusion Debunked. And I think there's another one that's about a related set of topics. So I don't want to spend too much time here, but very briefly, just for any listeners who are not familiar, I want to make sure everybody understands this net positive energy thing. What happened and what didn't happen. In 2022, they announced that there was this breakthrough. It's positive energy from fusion. It's a game changer. It's going to change everything. They basically lied. What they were talking about is the amount of laser energy that went into the fuel that they excited in order to do this experiment. The amount of energy they got out was more than the laser energy that went in. Just the amount of energy it took to energize, the amount of electricity it took to energize the laser was considerably more than the energy they got out. And if you count all of the energy that goes in, the running the vacuum pumps and the whole system, they got a tiny, tiny fraction of that. So this idea that, what matters to science, as you just put it, is net positive energy. Q is greater than 1 in nuclear speak. It's a science experiment. The innovation side of that, actually getting useful technology that helps society, that's not the science of Q is greater than 1. It's got to be Q is greater than at least 10 in order to get to the entire device is net energy positive. And I would also argue that there's no benefit to fusion over advanced fission. Is there an advantage to fusion over light water reactors from the 1950s that the way that we operate them in the US, although we don't need to, as a matter of policy, we just allow the waste. We call it waste. We shouldn't. As you said, we should be calling it future fuel, but we call it waste. We allow it to just accumulate. We shouldn't be doing it that way. We can do a much better job of nuclear energy with advanced fission. You don't need fusion in order to solve that problem. Advanced fission that doesn't produce that produces a waste stream that has no long-lived actinides, that everything in that waste stream has at most a 30-year half-life. That waste is not serious waste. It's a different kind of waste than the waste from today's nuclear reactors. So if we compared fusion to advanced fission, I don't think there's any reason to do it in the first place. Can anyone think of why you would?
Look,
We can't.
all I'll say is that we are once you get a working device, that's not the part that was hard for nuclear at all. It was very far away from that. It was decades away from getting cheap, operating, ultra reliable power, even when we had devices that looked like or even were the modern device. So for me, I don't know if I can answer you what the advantages might be. There might be some weird nuclear chemistry stuff where you need a bunch of a certain type of particles and it's just better to get it through a new fusion device. I'm not going to weigh in. That's not my field. I will say that the hard part is after you have a device that works some at commercial scale. Getting it to work every day and actually pay off its construction costs is profoundly difficult and something that nuclear had to earn decades after actually being built at scale across the world on grids.
Let's move on. Let's go ahead and wrap up now because I think we're pretty much done. Does anyone want to add anything before I just go into tell us about your contact details and so forth? I want to give everybody a chance to cover any topics they want to tonight.
I'm good.
All good? Okay, Mark Nelson, let's talk for people who want to follow your work, Radiant Energy Group, what you're doing there, lots of exciting stuff. You guys publish some of the best research going. Where do people find out what you're doing and where do people get more involved generally in learning more about nuclear energy?
Well, on our website, radiantenergygroup.com, any of our public-facing work we put up there. It's nice and pretty. Take a look, print it out, download the data. We do a lot of polling across the world because we don't necessarily trust anti-nuclear groups that run polls, and we don't necessarily trust nuclear trade groups that run polls. We want the actual opinions people have about nuclear, good or bad, unvarnished, raw, ugly, and we put those together with the world's biggest standardized polls across multiple countries at a time, and we have that on our website. For my unvarnished thoughts, you can definitely follow me on Twitter, x.com at EnergyBants. That's EnergyBants. It's an old joke left over from back when I was a student in Britain. And then anybody can DM me there, even the bots. Just send me a DM. I eventually get to it. And that is probably the best way to reach me. If you must email, Mark at radiantenergygroup.com is where you can find me.
Doomberg.
Yeah, thanks for the gracious invite tonight, Erik and Mark, for your participation. It was a great discussion. I learned a lot, and I enjoyed participating in it. You can find everything that we do at Doomberg.com. We are not a nuclear newsletter. We're an energy newsletter. We try to write at the interface between finance, energy, and geopolitics, and we like to apply lateral thinking to the problems of the day. We publish about 90 articles a year for our annual tier and a 45-minute to an hour-long webinar a month for our pro tier. You can find everything we do at Doomberg.com. Erik, big fan of the podcast, and Mark, always a pleasure to engage with you as well.
Back at you. Thanks, Doomberg. Thanks, Erik.
And for my part in this, I host Macro Voices, the free weekly podcast designed specifically for pro finance and sophisticated private investors. You can subscribe wherever you get your podcasts or find out more at macrovoices.com. For ZeroHedge, our sponsor, Van Eck, I'm Erik Townsend, and I'll see you again right here on August 14th when Dr. Nick Turan will argue in favor of the Mark Nelson view, a light water reactor-centric nuclear renaissance. Well, Dr. Jake DeWitt, who is the founder of Oklo, and I will make the case for putting a little more emphasis on developing Generation 4 nuclear technology as another mainstay of the coming renaissance. Again, that's all coming up August 14th. Meanwhile, for ZeroHedge, I'm Erik Townsend.
Now is the time to take advantage of the power of gold and silver to grow your wealth, whether you're an experienced investor or new to the game. These precious metals have a long history of being a safe haven for your savings, but they also offer growth potential, making them a wise investment choice. So where does the average investor go to buy gold and silver? That's easy. JM Bullion. JM Bullion is one of the most popular and most trusted precious metals retailers in the nation. We offer a huge selection of gold, silver, platinum, and palladium products that can be delivered to your door in safe, discreet, fully insured packaging. From 1 gram of gold to an entire mint box of silver, JM Bullion offers precious metals to suit every financial goal and budget. No matter your budget, now is the time to start investing in precious metals and start protecting yourself and your savings against these volatile markets. Visit jmbullion.com today to take a look at our wide variety of precious metals, rounds, coins, and bars, and find out how you can turn your savings into gold.